Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today as we review how to manage your tenant's security deposits in your Rentec Direct account. So my name is Janelle and my teammate Catherine is here with me today, and we're just really looking forward to making sure you feel confident in your tools.
Hi, everyone, and I just want to let you know that over on the right-hand side of your screen, if you have any questions for us, please just send them on over. So if Janelle happens not to touch bases on something you're looking for and or while she's talking, if you think of something, show us a question, we'd be happy to answer.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. And also, right next to that question tab that Catherine mentioned, there is another tab. It's called Polls. And I've sent you a couple questions, so I'd love for you to answer that, and you'll be able to see how your peers are responding. So just be sure to click on those two tabs there in the upper right corner of your screen. So the basics of managing a tenant security deposit include receiving it at move-in, and when they move out, charging for any damages and then just refunding the balance. Of course, there are lots of nuances that can happen depending on the tenant and, your management practice, but that's the gist, really. And the options you see here on your screen are what you'll find in the tenant's security deposit ledger. And we'll review them in a typical scenario. So if you have any unique circumstances, your client success team and Catherine are going to be able to walk you through that personal practice that you have and just make sure that you can reflect that in your software tools. So the very first steps related to the security deposit process is assessing your tenant the charge for the deposit, and then of course recording the payment you receive from them. So let's look at an account and we're going to walk through those steps together. Before we get rolling, I want to provide you what I think is a valuable tip. So, whenever you're working in your account and you get stumped about what steps to take first or next, I just want to remind you that you're going to want to reproduce what happens in the real world. And, that's Catherine's favorite phrase. Really helps to ask yourself that question, as I think it's easy to miss steps or combine steps because we just get so used to getting business done, we don't realize each step along the way that we complete. But ideally, you want your accounting ledgers to be a representation of the steps you took in real life. So we're basically just mirroring those here. And when you assign a tenant to a rental, you're going to be doing this through the property tab by clicking on place new tenant. So let's go ahead and do that here in my test account. We're going to go over to the property tab and we're going to click the button place new tenant. And I already created a tenant here, so I'm just going to choose existing, and I'm going to head on down here and I'm going to assess them a security deposit charge. Also, you're going to see here's where the security deposit is. You can change this amount if you want to, and you can say, I actually am only charging $500 security deposit, but then you're going to see that additional deposit. And this is a means for you to break out deposit types. So if you need to do that for things like pet deposit or key deposit, or maybe you're taking an additional deposit due to, maybe they had poor credit or background reasons, and whatever that reason is. It's also a great place to list if you have the policy of collecting last month's rent. You can store that in the security ledger. So that's basically the idea is you are wanting to have a place that you are listing, one, what you're charging, and then what they've paid for funds you're using at the end of their tenancy. So just wanted to mention that field there. So let's go ahead and place my tenant into the rental. All right. So we've got Jane Doe here. She's living in my property. And once you've placed your tenant into your rental, like we've done here, we're going to want to go into the security deposit ledger because we need to record that payment that our tenant has given us. So we're going to go on up here and we're going to click on the balance. And when you're in this regular tenant ledger, you're going to notice at the top, there's a button indicates on deposit. And right now it says 0 and it's red. And that's just because we've charged them, but we haven't recorded the payment. So if we click on this button, we're entering the security deposit ledger. And here you're going to see how much you've charged your tenant for security deposit. And we see here it's $500. And now we're ready to record the payment that we've received. So we're going to choose the first option on the menu. It's down here on the left where it says receive deposit. And then we're going to complete the details of their payment on the right side. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to imagine my tenant has paid me with a check and they paid the full amount. And you're going to see here that I'm entering the bank account I'm depositing this into. So I have tenant security deposit account is where I'm placing them. And you can place a memo note here. So once you've posted this transaction, you see here how it appears in the ledger detail on top. And if you close out of this deposit ledger, let me do that, you're going to see here on the top where it says on deposit. Now it shows that deposit payment that we just posted. So it's in green, which means that they have paid in full. There's also a tenant-based report called Current Deposit B, and that's found under the Reports tab here. And what I like about this report is that it shows you how much your tenants have paid, and you'll also see what was due. So also, if you notice that on the right side here, anything in red indicates that the tenant has paid less than what is due. So it's a visually an easy way to see, what they've paid and what you need to follow up on. So imagine this awesome tenant you have has been living in your rental for a while, and they come to your office and they say that they adopted this little kitty cat, and you say, oh, isn't that sweet? You're going to need to pay a $300 pet deposit. They are really excited, so they whip out their checkbook and they write you a check right on the spot. So we're going to go back into your account and show you how to accomplish this. So through your tenant security deposit ledger, let's get back in there, tenant tab, click on the balance, click on the on deposit button. You're going to be able to increase this deposit at any time, and you're going to be able to record the new payment activity. So let's go ahead and do that here. We're going to enter in what that pet deposit was that we're going to charge them, $300, and you can say pet deposit. I think it's good to add memo notes because down the road, a year from now, you won't remember all the details. So now that you've done that, you see at the top, there is an additional deposit due of $300. And we're going to go ahead and enter that payment that they gave us. So they gave us another check, $300. We are depositing it into the tenant security deposit account. And again, that memo line. All right. Pretty straightforward. Again, we're just doing each step as they happened in the real world. That's really, what our goal is here. So let's imagine these amazing tenants have lived with you for a year and you receive their notice to vacate. So, it's getting time for them to move out and you need to conduct that walkthrough inspection, on the rental just to make sure there aren't any damages because you're going to need to process that security deposit refund. That's the typical step that we take, right? So in your inspection, you go through your rental, you find, it's in pretty good shape, except that sweet little kitten peed on the carpet in the bedroom. So you let the tenant know you're going to be charging them for damages. And I want to walk you through that process of assessing them charges and refunding the deposit balance. So let's get back into that account here. So first we need to assess the tenant charges. Now I'm going to close out the security deposit ledger. And the reason why is because I recommend you do this through the standard tenant ledger, as it makes it easy to provide a final tenant statement. The statement that's found from the regular tenant ledger is a real nice one that you can send to them. So a few things to keep in mind. If any of the charges you're passing on to the tenant are vendor charges, meaning you have to pay a vendor for carpet cleaning or painting or whatever those turnover costs are, and you're going to be passing on that expense from that vendor charge to the tenant, rather than being in the tenant's side, we're going to click over to the property tab, and we're going to want to post that vendor charge to the property and link the tenant in. So let's do that right now. We're going to click on post expense in my property tab, and I'm going to indicate that I paid $300 and I paid my vendor. Let's see, I chose a carpet vendor here, and I can indicate a memo note. So this will show up in my property ledger and also on my tenant side. So pet damage. And just so you know, when we're in here, you're going to want to link in your tenant to this vendor charge because you're passing it on to the tenant. So I'm going to post the expense here, and we'll see that I've assessed. I'm going to click on the property balance. Here's that charge. I paid my vendor for the $300 carpet cleaning. And then over on the tenant tab, if I open up their ledger, I see that $300 charge here that we paid out. So the tenant was just assessed $300. So if you have a tenant charge that you need to assess and it's not property related, for example, maybe you're charging for maintenance repair material, that you have in stock, or maybe you're charging for wear and tear. We can agree that neither of these charges are new property expenses, so we don't want to post them on the property side. We want to post them on the tenant side. So just be asking yourself those questions, because it helps you tease out where you need to go. So we're going to do that. I'm going to post a $50 charge to the tenant for wear and tear, as there ended up being some scratches from that sweet kitty on the wood doors. So let's post this charge by clicking on the post expense button here in the tenant's ledger, and we're going to enter the details. So here is a tenant only charge, and I'm going to put a memo note, and I'm going to say wear and tear. There we go. So when I post this charge, you'll see it's now assessed in the tenant's regular ledger. So your next step is going to verify what this regular tenant balance is. So we see here that they have a pretty big amount that they owe. It says $1,798 So we need to write that down, because we're going to go over and we're going to pull that out of security and apply that here. So by applying that deposit amount towards this tenant ledger charge, you're simultaneously reflecting income on the property ledger. So if you're transferring deposit funds out of one bank account, meaning that security deposit account that they paid into, just know the funds are going to flow to the property's default income account. I want to let you see this in action, how we're going to transfer that deposit out. So we've written down our tenant's ledger balance under the tenant tab, and we're going to go into the tenant security deposit ledger here, and I see that we have $800 on hand. So I'm going to, before I complete this transfer, I just want to point out the field for linking in the bank account again. So we were going to apply the deposit as a tenant credit, but I want to point out this from account that's here on the right side. So if you're using one bank account for all your transactions, meaning rent, security deposits, you will want to list None for this account. Because basically you're not moving funds, you're just reallocating the funds from the tenant to the property. So, but here I'm reflecting what's the most common practice where managers hold deposits in a separate bank account. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to transfer the funds from the deposit ledger to the tenant ledger. And I'm going to indicate that we have let's go ahead and say $700 here. We're going to transfer $700 out. And we're going to say it is, if you have a special category that you're using, you can do that. You can say forfeited deposit from tenant, and you can indicate apply to tenant charges. All right, now that we've done this and I close it out, you're going to see here, if I refresh my browser, we applied $700. This is to the tenant's ledger. So it came from security deposit, applied to their regular charges. And you may see here that you have some charges on here. This is a good time to ask yourself, are all these charges correct? Looks like there's a charge for future rent, and I know they moved out. So I'm going to delete that and get rid of it. So we see here the last transaction being that credit. And if I head on over to the property ledger, just so you can see a flow of that security deposit, and I click on the balance, I see now that $700 that was applied towards any outstanding charges. And now if I also go over to the bank account ledger under the accounts tab, I can see if I look at both ledgers, it went out of one account and into the other. So here is where it went out, the very bottom, $700 is the out, the debit transaction. And back in my other account, I see a credit. So there is the full transfer of funds there. All right. So let's talk about your next step. Now that you've accounted for all your tenant charges and your balances due, it's time to issue out a refund and send your tenant a statement. So that's what we're going to do now. So to issue out a refund to your tenant, we're going to head back to the Tenant Security Deposit ledger. And we're going to choose the action down there below receive deposit. It's return deposit. So if you're using, Rentec to print checks, you're going to see that option available. So let's just look at that step. We're going to click return deposit. So it looks like we have $100. So I'm going to select print check, enter in my office check number, whatever that may be, and the amount I'm returning, which is the $100. And I can indicate here what this transaction is about. Now that I've refunded the deposit in this tenant ledger, you're going to want to physically refund it by either printing or, writing a check. Most states also require that you provide an accounting statement of the security deposit. And to do this, in the top right corner of this deposit ledger, you're going to see that printer icon. So if you just click on that, you'll be able to print that out. And if you've assessed them any charges, you're also going to want to provide them a tenant statement that accounts for these charges, because it's important they know, what were these tenant charges. So let's go and do that. We're going to close this out, close our security ledger, go back to the tenant tab, and in the tenant menu, you'll see an option to print a statement. Once you create this statement, you're going to see here the full accounting detail. Now, of course, you get the flow of this, what's going to appear in the ledger and why, and you can print this out. So now that you've printed these out, you can mail these statements and any refund check that you have to your tenant, and it's just really it's an easy process if you understand the ins and the outs there. So let's get into just a couple more details, because we've covered all the easy peasy there. So remember, if you have any security deposit questions you would like Catherine to answer, remember you can shoot her a question right now through that webinar tool. Just click on that questions tab. So now we've covered those core steps. Let's talk about those situations that just aren't so cookie cutter in approach, because we know that's not always just how it works. So for you property managers out there, after you accept your tenant security deposit payment, if you turn around and send those funds directly to the property owner rather than holding them, I'm going to offer you some instructions. And all you others out there that do not follow this practice, just close your ears or get a drink of coffee. But imagine you were transferring the deposit to the owner directly. You would use this option down here in the bottom left, transfer deposit, and you'd enter on the right side the details of that transfer. So back here in the beginning, when we had $800, if we were turning around and giving it to the owner, we would indicate $800, and you could indicate that you were transferring it. I have a category I created, release deposit to owner. And you're going to indicate which account you pulled it out of and where it's going to, because it has to get transferred out of deposits and go to the property. And then once you've submitted this, you then are going to want to physically send the funds to the owner. So you have to, after this step of transfer deposit, you're going to do an owner disbursement on the property. Remember, when we do transfers, it flows out of here and applies as income. So it goes to the property, you turn around and send it out. If you don't deposit the payment into your bank account first, for you property managers out there, but rather you mail that physical check directly to the property owner you're managing for, you have two options, and each have issues to consider, because this tool was designed for property managers that do traditional property management, including funds management. So I stress that the method I showed you just now is the best option, meaning do that transfer of funds. But let's look at some alternative workarounds, because you may need that. There are some, other exceptions I want you to consider, and those are connected to security deposits. We know many tenants receive a refund on their security deposit. However, every now and then we see tenants that have a credit on their regular ledger at the time of move out. Maybe they overpaid their rent last month. Even though this isn't a deposit, since we're talking about tenant refunds, I think it's useful to understand this task at this stage. So what you would do is then you would just post an equal expense to the property ledger. So the reason we do it this way is that we need to reflect the refund against the original income category, the property, the bank, and the owner ledgers that they were tied to. So that's why if you have a credit on the regular tenant ledger, you post an expense on the property and you indicate, you're paying that tenant out. A question we hear, from time to time is, can tenants pay their security deposit payment electronically? And the short answer is maybe and no. Let me explain. So all tenant electronic payments are classified by default to the category of rental income. And you don't want to have to record your deposit payment as rental income. But if you did, you could edit the transaction in the tenant ledger and adjust the income category to be security deposit to show this. And if you're using a separate bank account from your rent collection bank account for your tenant security deposit payments, this is just going to throw that transaction sideways. So only one bank account can be tied to each property for electronic payments currently. But if you decide, to collect that deposit into your rent account, you'd have to transfer funds from one bank account to the other and then edit the account. And, bottom line is we just don't advise collecting security deposits electronically. We recommend you just, let your new tenants know they need to submit that deposit payment to you via check. So you can easily use this opportunity, to talk about helping them set up their electronic payments or, to be for their future rent payments. So just wanted to mention that. That's a question that comes in. Another caveat to consider is for whatever reason, you need to delete either of the transfer style transactions. Remember that apply deposit as tenant credit or transfer the deposit to the owner. If for whatever reason you need to delete that, just keep in mind if you delete it out of the tenant security ledger, you will need to manually delete it out of the other ledgers it may be tied to, such as the property, the tenant's regular ledger, if it was a transfer to the tenant's ledger, or the bank ledger. You just want to make sure you do that. This step may be automated in the future, but at this time it requires a second step. Catherine, do you have any questions that came in that we didn't cover in our presentation that you think that others, may benefit by hearing? I'd love to hear from you on that.
Yeah, there was actually a question that came in when you were talking about, or right before you started talking about a pet deposit or additional deposit. And so one thing that I wanted to make sure to point out is that, of course, all states are different, and not only states, but at county and city levels as well. So some people can hold those pet deposits as a refundables, and then some have non-refundables, so they release them right away. So there's those two different scenarios that came up that Chris actually asked. And so yes, if it's something that you do not hold in a security account, you can release those funds right away if you collect them for a pet or any additional deposits that are considered those non-refundables.
That's a great thing to bring up. I'm glad Chris asked that because that was the exact scenario I had when I was a property manager. We had in Oregon, was where I was doing my management, is we called it was a fee because it's not really a deposit. I mean, the term deposit indicates you're holding something, right? It's a pet fee. I find that a lot of clients will record that in the regular tenant ledger. They'll indicate over here under the tenant side, they come in here instead of handling this through the security ledger, they say this is, and you may call it a pet deposit. If that applies in your state, you need to call it that, or a pet fee or pet deposit. And when you create this expense for your tenant, let's just imagine it's $300. Here's the charge for the tenant rather than handling it through the security ledger. And then when they pay it, if you record the income, it's going to flow over to your property immediately. So that may be a workaround. What do you think about that, Catherine, for Chris's question that if there are immediate fees that you're going to gain, you don't even route that through the security ledger?
Right. I totally agree. I think it's just perfectly fine to post it just like you showed here in this example. So it would work well. One more thing I wanted to point out, just because you were talking, I want to make sure people understand that many states have so many days in which you can return a security deposit. So in Oregon, it's 31. Some are up to 45, and there's other states that are like 14 or 15. So make sure you're following your guidelines for your area on how many days you have to return that deposit once a tenant vacates.
Excellent. That is a very good point. I know in Oregon, if you don't return it in a timely fashion, the tenant can possibly claim, at least when I was managing, up to a double deposit. So each state is going to be different. So definitely follow those rules. That's a good point to bring up there. Any other questions that we should cover while we've got everyone together today?
I think that was that's the most I could think of right off the top of my head. There was one, I believe, about releasing money directly to the owner, which you already kind of went over. So that was perfect. And I think that's it.
Awesome. All right. So I think it's a wrap. Thanks so much for participating and, being diligent to learn, how to use your Rentec Direct software. So we just really appreciate your business and want you to know if you have any questions, even outside of this webinar, just reach back to your client success team. They're very helpful and they want to make sure that you have the knowledge you need. So have an excellent day, friends.